Hello everyone. Sorry, I'm not going to do my talk in two languages. I'm going to stick to English. So before we get started, I just wanted to say a few short words about the film we're about to watch. So it's an Australian film, if you're not aware, and it might not surprise you to learn that Australians are pretty good at eco-horror. If any country has any reason to be very scared of the natural world that it has on hand, it's definitely Australia. So released in 1978, The Long Weekend, it's really quite a late entry into the 1970s eco-horror boom. Maybe some of you just saw The Birds earlier this evening. That's a kind of very early example of that, released in 1962. Or maybe you're more familiar with other films like Night of the Lepus, Frogs, Kingdom of the Spiders, Grizzly, Jaws, Piranha, Prophecy, lots of which you just saw in that great trailer at the start, all from the 1970s as well, though mainly American. These films generally have a message for us. If we keep damaging nature, nature is going to fight back. It's going to take its revenge. Exactly which parts of nature take their revenge can vary. Sometimes it's spiders, sometimes it's frogs, or bears, or ants, or even rabbits. But the one thing they have in common is that they're coming to get you. This is the most familiar form of eco-horror narrative, and it's definitely the most enduring. Again, in that trailer, you would have seen films like The Happening. I think The Bay is also showing at this festival, and they're really good examples of how that very familiar structure of nature bites back has continued into the 21st century from the 1970s. But in Australian cinema specifically, it has quite an interesting relationship with nature, I suppose, in the horror genre. So you have films like The Long Weekend, which we're about to see, which takes part in that very specific revenge of nature genre. But you also have more, I suppose, if I can use the word, subtle encounters with the genre as well. Maybe some of you might have seen Peter Weir's Picnic at Hanging Rock from 1975. It's not that, there are no creatures coming to get you in that film, but in this very Australian landscape, you'll see that the natural world has this kind of incomprehensible, terrifying, like unknowable power over people. It's quite restrained in the way it does it, but again, it kind of partakes in this fear of the natural world that you will see in The Long Weekend as well. It's just maybe a little bit more restrained about it. To switch to referring to a film that is a lot less restrained, also from the 70s and Australian, probably a lot of you have seen Mad Max as well. It was released the year after The Long Weekend in 1979. It's maybe considered more of a thriller than a horror film, but it's set in a dystopia where cars and petrol are the main currency among people, and it's not hard to link that to current or contemporary even environmental fears. The most recent Mad Max film, which again I feel probably a lot of people here have seen, Fury Road, which was released in 2015, makes this much more explicit again, with a story focused around this tyrannical figure who has control of the water supply and uses that to exert control on the world around him. But as I say, Long Weekend is probably a less subtle engagement with the theme of the environment in horror. But it is an interesting example, as you're going to see. It's not, I don't think you could call it subtle in its message. As you'll see, at the heart of the story are this couple. They're truly terrible people. You'll get to know them over the next hour and a half or so, and they really don't seem to be able to go more than sort of 2 minutes on screen without doing something that makes you really hate them. It's really impressive how terrible they are. But rather than just relying on gore and shock and just video nasties, which you will have seen if you have watched some of the American eco-horror of the 70s, this does try to engage in a more, and I know I said it wasn't subtle, it tries to engage in a slightly more subtle way. It builds on dread, it builds on suspense. Watch out for, without spoiling anything, watch out for the dugong, the kind of seal-like creature. It is one of the most, in my mind, enduring images of horror film that I know. So before I finish up, I just want to kind of share a quote from the screenwriter of the film that I think just, I suppose, introduces the film, which is what I'm supposed to be doing, introduces the film quite well. He explained that he was inspired by a trip he took to an isolated beach on the coast of New South Wales in Australia. He says, "I started Long Weekend as a way to avoid the writing doldrums while convincing myself I was working. Long Weekend was a unique project because I began with no outline, no notes or research, very little idea as to where the story was going, and absolutely zero knowledge of screenplays. I simply started at page 1, scene 1, and made it up as I went along. I had only a vague plan to write a kind of environmental horror story. My premise was that Mother Earth has her own autoimmune system, so when humans start behaving like cancer cells, she attacks. I also wanted to avoid a Jaws-like critter film. I wanted the Long Weekend beasties to all be benign looking and not overtly aggressive." So I suppose I would think of that as a good introduction to the film in the context of maybe, especially if you're going to see other 1970s horror films as part of this festival, maybe have a think about how it plays off those, tries to do something different, and I'll leave it up to you to decide if it succeeds or not. So that's me. Please enjoy the film, and thank you very much.